It's a great privilege for me to be here this evening to deliver this talk. If I were to change the direction of my life over the last 10 years, I'd certainly take a different pathway for reasons that you'll see in just a moment. Now, I make an apology, or perhaps not, that I've given this talk or I've talked on this subject in other fora before. So if you've heard it, do forgive me, but I think the message that we're trying to convey is an important one, and therefore I think it's a subject that's well worth consideration. What I went through is it's perhaps a classic example of how not to handle events when things go wrong in medicine. How trusts delegate their responsibilities entirely to the interests of perhaps corporate greed and so on, as you'll see. Let me start my story by taking you to the Old Bailey. This was in 2013 when I appeared in court. It's the highest criminal court in the land, and just quite why the Crown Prosecution Service decided to hold my trial in the Old Bailey still eludes me. But I guess what they were trying to do was to set an example, really, of the medical profession in general. It's an intimidating place to be, needless to say. The judge said to me, "Stand up, David Selou." There had been enormous press interest in my case. As you can imagine, a surgeon being on trial for killing his patient. The courtroom was packed to capacity. The judge said, "David Selou, for the offense of unlawfully killing Mr. A, I sentence you to 2.5 years in prison." I got handcuffed in the dock. I stood up. As I was walking out, I looked up in the gallery and had a fleeting glance at my family who were crying. I went down. I was taken in a prison van and taken to the highest security prison in the country. One question I get asked frequently is, when that conviction was passed, how did it feel? Well, I had a number of emotions that were weighing on my mind. The first, of course, went to my patient. He'd trusted his life to me, and I didn't save it. Obviously, as you'll see in time, it wasn't my fault. But nevertheless, I was at the top of the command chain, and I felt very sorry for that. I felt sorry for him and his family. I also had obvious emotions in me, and one of the newspapers that I saw subsequently said he showed no emotion when the sentence was passed. Well, I didn't really have the emotion to show. For the previous 3 years, my family and I had been through what had been an extremely difficult time. And by now, I think the adrenaline had completely dried out, and there was no emotion to show. Now, I just take you back slightly to the judge's sentencing remark, where he said to me, "I sentence you for the unlawful killing of this patient." So I put emphasis on that word. That summarized essentially what happened to that patient. What he didn't say in all of this was that the patient that I was treating had a condition. He'd perforated his bowel, had fecal peritonitis. He didn't make any mention of the fact that this patient also was found to have cirrhosis of his liver, which impacts negatively on the chances of recovery from a major operation. The patient was grossly obese, He'd also had a major operation only 5 days earlier. Now, I ask you to contemplate on that for a moment. What it means is that if we as healthcare workers take on the care of people who are desperately ill, when they do die, we get blamed for killing them. Now, this is clearly unjust and is going to be impacting negatively on the care of people who are seriously ill. For those of us on the coalface who have to make these decisions, we're going to be shying away from making difficult decisions that may sometimes save patients' lives. Now, killing somebody unlawfully is a serious crime for which there is a serious punishment. Remember, in this country, we used to hang people for some forms of unlawful killing. The last hanging in England was in 1963. This law was still on the statute books until quite recently. So it's a serious crime for which there is a serious punishment. Okay, mine wasn't a hanging offense. Nevertheless, I would not want anyone to underestimate the gravity of what was being imposed upon me. People just facing the regulators, the General Medical Council, have been known to take their own lives. And while I was in prison, people actually did hang themselves in prison. So this is a serious crime for which there is a severe punishment. It therefore is incumbent upon any court that imposes such a punishment to make sure that its processes are beyond reproach, to make sure that the jury who are passing this sentence are well informed and knowledgeable. It's also important to make sure that they are sure of the verdict, which is clearly the criminal threshold. I've got 2 question marks here, and I'll just throw them in for thought. Let me make an analogy. Suppose you went into hospital and somebody said to you, "You've got bowel cancer," just for the sake of argument. And you say to them, "Well, how did you reach that diagnosis?" You'd surely want to be sure that the way that your specimen was collected was all beyond reproach, that the person or people making that diagnosis are well informed, and that if they get it wrong, they can be held to account. But what if I told you that in reaching that diagnosis, I got together a team of 12 people, completely lay people who have no knowledge of medicine or pathology, because I don't want that knowledge to interfere in their fair judgment? If I say to you that those people simply had to say cancer or no cancer or not cancer, and not have to determine the pathway to which they reach that diagnosis, you would be surely aggrieved. If I said to you that there is a legal requirement that those people cannot be held to account if they get it wrong, that can't be just. But that's precisely how the law works in passing a sentence in what is a life-changing situation. What if I also told you that in reaching the diagnosis of cancer, some groups of people are disadvantaged? That if you are from an ethnic minority background, your diagnosis is either delayed or not made at all, so that you are denied life-saving treatment. Now, the reason I say that is because we know there have been accusations that there is racism in the criminal justice system. Well, let's start from our own base, from the National Health Service, from healthcare. We know that healthcare is racist. Now, this is how Malcolm Willett, who illustrates the BMJ, depicted the problem. He showed a bus, the bus of opportunities in the health service, taking people to the land of advancement and so on. He depicts the pink faces inside the bus, safely tucked in there, whereas the colored faces were all standing outside in the rain, sheltering under their own umbrellas, But not only were they left behind, but water was being splashed on them from the side of the road. That's how it feels to be an ethnic minority worker in the health service. Sadly, the same process continues into the criminal justice system. This law of gross negligence manslaughter has been applied, and it seems the only victims of it, the only people who've been convicted, have all been from ethnic minority backgrounds, bar one. I put them all there on that slide for you to see. From about 2012 to 2016, 6 people from healthcare have been convicted. The last one, Isabel Amaro, was a nurse. She was Spanish, not Anglo-Saxon. In other words, no Anglo-Saxon has so far, out of that 6, been convicted of this crime. Now people say, oh yeah, the numbers are small, and we've got to wait for more statistics to really be able to draw conclusions. Well, it took 2 crashes of 737 Mach 8 for Boeing to ground the whole fleet. They didn't wait for, they didn't say, oh, the numbers of crashes is small. After all, we fly billions of flights, throughout the year. When something unjust of that magnitude is seen in our midst, I think we all have a responsibility to really speak out for it. And all I say to that is simply the tip of a major iceberg which blights our profession, that there is far more going on beneath that iceberg from what we've seen of late, the number of people being referred to the regulator from ethnic minority backgrounds. Okay, very quickly, let's just wind back a little bit. I'm not going to go into great details about my own past, but I qualified in Manchester in 1973. I trained, I worked in the Middle East, and then I came back as a senior lecturer in surgery in London. And it was in February 2010 when a patient died under my care in a private hospital. Time does not allow me to go into the details of all that happened. What I want to draw your attention to are just what happens when something does go wrong in medicine. If you look at all of that, the whole emphasis of this man's death was placed on my shoulder. There was no attempt whatsoever to look at patient safety aspects, the very issue that we're all here to look into today, to look at today. The hospital where this occurred did 2 investigations. The first was into me, and the second was into systemic issues. And the only document that saw the light of day was the one into my own role in the management of this patient. The root cause analysis, which by law should have been produced during the investigation, was never brought to the light of day until much, much, much later, way after I'd served my sentence. But it also shows the number of steps that one goes through when something goes wrong in medicine and in nursing. I was charged with perjury, again a very frivolous charge in my view, and it was only the Crown prosecution's way of making sure that if they compounded a minor charge it's a major charge, again with a manslaughter charge, it makes it that more difficult for me to defend myself. I know we're running out of time, but the jury were out. They came back and they said to the judge, "My lord, this has been a complex trial. We don't really understand what it is that you're asking us to adjudicate on." The judge said to them, "Oh, you are the jury. You go away. If you think that he's guilty, then find him guilty, but you've got to be sure." But they just said they can't be sure. But that, I'm afraid, was the sum total of the direction that the judge gave them. So they went away, they came back, and they found me guilty of manslaughter by a majority of 10-2. So it wasn't even the fact that they were all sure of the diagnosis of the conviction. There was obviously some debate amongst the jury. As I say, I was taken in a prison van. I went to Belmarsh, a high-security prison. Time does not allow me to go into the details of what I went through, only to say that I was locked up in a cell, 5 steps by 3, which is about the equivalent of a domestic toilet, with 2 other prisoners with a toilet bowl to one side of the room that everybody used. I lived there, we ate there, we slept there, and sometimes we were locked up for 22 hours a day. A pretty dehumanizing experience, which is actually against European law, the very law to which the United Kingdom is signed up. I was in the midst of violent criminals, and it was a very harrowing experience for me and my family. After I served my sentence, Dr. Jenny Vaughan, who's one of our panel members, looked at all of this and was outraged. She set up a panel of people who helped in the appeal. Ultimately, I'm glad to say my appeal was, my conviction was overturned, but I got no compensation and no apology. Unfortunately, the inquest that had been started into this patient's death was discontinued. So even the family got no explanation at all as to why their loved one died. I was hauled up in front of the regulator, the General Medical Council, a 6-week trial into the whole event all over, and they found me completely not wanting of any charge, that I was completely cleared of all the allegations that had been made. So, what does it all mean in terms of, I just bring in the issue of regulation. And I think there is a big question in my own mind as to whether regulation really helps patient safety. My own argument is it doesn't. It takes too long. It took 8 years for the GMC to ultimately clear me of no wrongdoing, of the fact that I'd done no wrong, by which time I'd completely lost my career. There were nursing issues, there were issues to do with radiography, there were systemic issues, and unfortunately, the regulators involved had not really joined up. It's a little bit like having a crash on the M1 and taking out the first person at the top of the queue and saying it's your fault, but we won't look into the fact that it was a winter's day, there was snow on the ground, there was poor lighting, and so on. And I think, unfortunately, this is how regulation works. I know there are people from the medical and nursing regulators in our midst, and I really do challenge them to come up with an answer to, are you actually working for patient safety? My own argument is that the way that regulation works is completely counterproductive to patient safety. I'd really want them to convince me otherwise. So I did nothing wrong. I lost my reputation, I lost my profession. And then the final blow for us as a family is someone who's in the audience today, my son James. He also qualified from Manchester. And one day when I came out of prison, he came up to me and my wife and he said, "Mum, Dad, I've qualified in medicine." Well, we knew he'd qualified in medicine. He did an intercalated master's degree, so he'd spent 6 years of his life studying medicine. He said he no longer wanted to go into medicine. So I said, "Well, can you give me a reason why?" He said, "Well, when we were growing up, you spent most of your life, treating patients in hospital. You missed most of our sports days, our nativity plays, and so on. And when one single incident happens, which wasn't even your fault, you get humiliated to this degree. I, too, have been racially abused while I've been studying. If this is what medicine has to offer, then it's not for me." And James sadly left medicine, and he's never stepped foot in a hospital ever again. So that's very sad, if that's the sort of message that we're passing to our, the people who are behind us. We've obviously been listening to the Chief Nursing Officer of England, giving us our own vision of the profession. If this is the kind of message that we're passing on to our trainees, then clearly this is all wrong. I put there what I believe needs to change, but let me move on very briefly to just talk about how perhaps we can improve all this. I know there's been a session on aviation and the role of aviation, what we can learn from safety in aviation. I'm not an expert in this field, but we know the devastating effects of an airline crash. If they can surmount these sorts of problems and come up with an industry that is safe, one of the safest forms of transport, I'm sure we can do it. I know aviation and healthcare are not the same thing, but somehow they've managed to produce a mode of transport which is one of the safest there is. And just to finish, this chap is Chesley Sullenberger. He was the man who, when the flight from LaGuardia Airport in New York took off to Atlanta, he was at the wheels of that airplane. A flock of geese got sucked up into the engine, so the engines were completely taken out, and yet he managed to land that plane on the Hudson River, saving the lives of 150 people on board. This is what Chesley Sullenberger had to say. He said, "Everything we know in aviation, every rule in the book, every procedure we have, we know because someone somewhere died." In other words, in aviation, every death is a learning opportunity. Sadly, in our healthcare profession, every death is merely an opportunity for blame. That has got to stop. And just finally, to finish, I'd just like to thank my wife and my family and Dr. Jenny Vaughan, who helped very much in the appeal, without whose help I'd never been able to overturn this conviction. I've written all this experience in a book, which is coming out tomorrow. There are obviously huge numbers of issues that I don't have the time to propound upon this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, David. A very sobering talk, it's fair to say, and something that gives every one of us here, I think, pause for thought. And the reason we've assembled an excellent panel here today is to discuss the issue that you found yourself facing, but also to try and find some answers for going forward and getting to a better place. And I'm joined on our panel today by Dr. Jenny Vaughan, who helped David to overturn his conviction, and next to her, Sir Norman Williams, who chaired a review into the law on gross negligence manslaughter for the government, and next to him we have Andrea Sutcliffe, the Chief Executive of the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and James Titcombe at the end there, who's our patient voice today and obviously a well-known safety campaigner. And I think if I can start with you, James, we heard from David there from a clinical perspective of being a clinician blamed for something when wrongly. Yeah. As a patient, there are lots of patients out there who believe there are times when clinicians need to be held to account, that there are times when people need to be prosecuted. And that's true, isn't it? Just give me your perspective in response to David's.
I think that's absolutely true, Sean. So first of all, David, I was absolutely shocked by your story. And I think the damage to trust that incidents like that, and that story does, is immense, and it's a disaster for patient safety, it's a disaster for everybody involved. From my perspective, so I lost a baby boy in 2008 as a consequence of failures at Morecambe Bay, and actually the regulator, the professional regulator, took a very long time to look at the practice of those individuals, and eventually, many years later, 10 years later, 2 midwives were struck off, but very sadly, during that time that those midwives were under investigation, more babies died. So your point, Sean, actually, that there are times when the actions of an individual are such that something needs to be done is crucial. So what this, I think, is about is trust, isn't it? So patients need to trust that when something has gone wrong, a process of investigation will be carried out that actually does acknowledge where things are in that category, that very rare category where somebody is at risk. But from a health professional, they need to trust that that process will treat them absolutely fairly, and they won't be inappropriately blamed for actions that other competent healthcare professionals could make in that dysfunctional system. And the answer actually to both those problems, I think, is very similar, and it's to have more expertise at the point of when something goes wrong. And I think the problem in the past is we haven't had that expertise. We haven't had people that are capable of looking at error in view of the true complexity, to consider the system, to consider the human factors. Very easily in that situation, the finger is pointed at somebody inappropriately. That creates this culture of fear, that destroys learning, and we end in this kind of negative spiral.
We look to the individual first and not the system.
Absolutely.
Andrea, let me bring you in here as the regulatory voice on the panel. And obviously, David issued a challenge that you might want to come back on. And of course, in your previous role at the CQC as well, you've looked at systems. Just what is your initial reflection to David's story, and also how we perhaps move to a better place so that people like David don't unfortunately find themselves being taken to Belmarsh prison?
Thank you, Sean. I think the first thing I'd like to say is to say thank you to David for sharing his story, because it is important for us to hear his story, as it's been important for us to hear James's story and others who have been affected by poor care. And I think the key thing for me is, and we've heard quite a lot over these last 2 days about the pursuit of a just culture. And I think it's actually really important for us to consider what does that mean and what do we want it to achieve. And as David's story shows, health and social care, I've got nurses working in lots of different settings. It's a people world. It's risky. Folk have got complex conditions. There will be mistakes. But what we need to have is a culture that enables people to be open and honest about those mistakes, to learn from them, because people who have been affected by poor care, they want to know why, what happened, why it happened, what can be done so it doesn't happen to other people in the future. And people who are working in the system, they want to be respected, they want to be listened to, they don't want to be hung out to dry, they absolutely don't want to be discriminated against, and they want to be able to provide the care that they've trained to do. So I think that we need to think about how do we create those conditions so that people, as you quite rightly say, James, that people who are using health and social care services can trust, and people who are delivering those services can trust. And I would respond to David's challenge, as you've invited me to do, because I absolutely think that professional regulators have a role in supporting safety. And that is because we have a role to set standards, we have a role to ensure that people's education is right and proper, we maintain the register, we support people revalidating throughout their career, we respond to fitness to practice issues. But I think that, and it comes out of both David's story and James's story, it's how we do it that's really important. And it's the how in terms of how we treat people with dignity and respect, how we listen to people who come to us with concerns and respond appropriately to that, but how we also understand how difficult this is for the individuals who are under our scrutiny. There are very few people who get out of bed in the morning to go to work to do a bad job. And when people are under scrutiny, they are going to feel awful, as David quite eloquently described. So what we've been doing at the Nursing and Midwifery Council is 3 things. One, to really understand the context, to work with people at a local level, to understand what was happening, and actually, is this something which is uniquely an individual's responsibility that they should be held to account for? Or is this something that actually anybody on that day could have made that mistake? And there are other issues that the organisation itself has to look at, because what James wants to know when something's gone wrong for him or his loved one is that it's going to get sorted. So if it's not the individual, it's something else, and we can't kind of ignore that. And equally, what we're trying to do at the NMC is to support the people who are coming to us with problems about poor care, to treat them with dignity and respect. Frankly, to be kind. We're not in the business of trying to make people feel worse. And I think that we have to apply those same principles to the registrants on our register, the professionals on our register. This is not an either-or. It's not about being lovely to patients and horrible to nurses and doctors. It's actually, if we treat everybody with that dignity and respect, we'll start to create that culture. We'll start to recover the trust that, as James has said, is lost when we hear stories like these.
So Norman, you did your report for Jeremy Hunt, I believe, and around this issue with a high-profile case recently. And I did want to ask you about you're obviously a clinician, and you looked at the law on gross negligence, manslaughter, and these issues. Where are you today on this?
Well, thanks, Sean. And I've listened to David. I listened to him. He provided evidence. I sat with my colleagues. We had a superb panel, and we had some very harrowing stories. And we had harrowing stories both from clinicians, and when I say clinicians, I'm not just talking about doctors. It's all healthcare professionals, because that's what we were looking at. So we heard harrowing stories in David's story, and we heard also harrowing stories from patients' families, where people had unfortunately lost their loved ones. And I had one-to-one conversations with such individuals. And I think it taught me, and something that Andrew was saying, there has to be a balance here. You're absolutely right. There has to be a degree of accountability for healthcare professionals. I mean, you take Patterson, for instance. I mean, there has to be something there. But also, you have to have fairness in the system for healthcare professionals. And that can be a difficult balance. But what we did find was there is a huge inconsistency in the process. And I want to stress the inconsistency, because that's what we heard. The evidence we heard was that you could be up in a coroner's court, and you could be investigated for gross negligence manslaughter, or it can be suggested by the coroner that could happen, or that recommendation, the police should be involved. And in another part of the country, you could be congratulated for the care that you've given and how sad it was that the individual died. So what I think, and the other important thing, and Jenny provided some information from the CPS in regard to this, each year there are approximately 30 cases that are investigated, but only one that goes to prosecution, which is, quite a statistic, actually, because, in other words, a lot of people are investigated. It's not very good, if I was heading up the CPS, I wouldn't be happy with those statistics. The point being really is that if you're investigated for such a serious event, that's terrible. That's absolutely appalling. And it takes so long, as David articulated. So we had to do something about that, and that's what our recommendations were about, trying to drive out the inconsistencies in the process, but also taking it back to very early on. We made various recommendations that weren't just all about gross negligence manslaughter. They tried to look at the whole system. And the local investigations of serious incidents can be very, very good. And I'm sure there are people in this audience who are quite impressed by them in their own different trusts, etc. But it can be appalling, absolutely appalling. And so again, it's important to have a consistency. It's important to have appropriate training around those incidents. It's appropriate to have people who are involved in them to understand the human factors, systemic factors, that the person that when an incident happens, it's a classical James Reason, the Swiss cheese. It's not one event. And therefore, you shouldn't be just looking. We were very impressed with the health safety executive when they came in, because they said, well, we don't go for the individual. We look at the system straight off. Now, why don't we do that in healthcare? Sometimes they occasionally do recommend that somebody should be prosecuted, but it's rare. Whereas we look for blame. When I say we, as a healthcare professional, you know, the whole healthcare system, we look for blame. Now, I hope, I think this is the beginning, and I could go on for hours, and I won't, but our recommendations were about improving consistency, not just for when unfortunately somebody dies and it's thought to be gross negligence, but in the whole system. Yeah. Improving expert witnesses, training, etc., understanding about human factors, understanding about unconscious bias. I mean, that is a huge problem, I think, in the NHS. I'm sure a lot of people in this audience understand exactly what I mean. So, all those recommendations, they don't just go to the police, the CPS and all the rest of it. They also go to the trusts and, I hope, the regulators. Because I know it was very controversial when we said, particularly in the GMC, when we said the right of appeal should go, because that had been a major issue with one particular case. Yeah. But we made various recommendations about the regulators, which I hope and I believe they'll take in place. Yeah. More consistency is required there. We have 9 healthcare professional regulators. Yeah. And they're all doing different things to some extent. And we have this overarching professional, the PSA, above that. And I think they have a much greater role. And they're starting to do it. Yes. And the recommendations are being, I've just been in touch with the civil servants before I came up here. They are gradually being brought into place. Let me bring Jenny in here, because Jenny, you've been doing obviously great work in helping David, but I know you work in other cases as well. And Norman talks about getting the balance between the sort of two tensions, if you like. And it strikes me one way we could very easily help to give back some trust and get this balance is to change the law in England, because as I understand it, the law in England on gross negligence manslaughter is very different to the law in Scotland, which includes a requirement for the guilty person to be willful and reckless in their behaviour. Now, I know Sir Norman wasn't asked to look at that, and neither was another review that the GMC have done. I just wonder what you think about that. If that change was made tonight, doesn't that mean that for the vast majority of professionals, their fear would vanish overnight? Because most people, of course, are not willful and reckless when they make mistakes. So I'm just interested in your perspective there.
I mean, I think that's a very important question, Sean, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak at the conference. I just want to add, it was actually a privilege to help David. I was very much helped by his wife, Catherine Sellu, who's in the audience, and lots of people at the hospital who'd known David for a number of years. And I just have one comment to make, and it's a good one. If you're a professional working in any high-risk environment, you need to be very nice, kind, compassionate, and get on well with all the people that you work with, because you'll see them up on the way up, and you'll need them if you're ever going to go down. And it was a tribute to David's character that I had no shortage of friends to call on to help in what was an extraordinarily difficult process. Not because David was not innocent. As you can see, he was finally exonerated, but because, touching on the point you've made, Sean, it is incredibly difficult to get an appeal in this country when someone has been convicted, even when you know that actually they are innocent and the evidence simply doesn't stack up. If you said to me, do we need to change the law? I think it's very difficult to compare England and Scotland because actually gross negligence manslaughter is a common law. So I'm sure many of you know that it can be applied in healthcare, it can be applied to police, it can be applied to police force, it can be applied to teachers, it can be applied to mothers and fathers, people who run bouncy castles. So we've had a number of convictions in its use in common law. And what the effect of the various appeals have shown is now we are in a position where because of David's case, the law was actually changed there, in that now judges have to direct, it led to effectively a change in the law because judges now have to effectively direct juries much more tightly as to the seriousness of the offence. It has to be truly exceptionally bad. Now, I agree with David. I think it's hard for juries to get that when it's healthcare because it's an incredibly complex environment. But I don't really want an assault on the jury system, but I think it's very hard for lay people to understand that in a complex environment. When we look at Scotland, it isn't just the law there. I think there's a different culture there. I think there's much more of a tendency there to look at the system and look, when something goes wrong, actually what you should do first is look at the system. You shouldn't just be gunning for the individual. If you can examine the system and you can show that that system is squeaky clean and there weren't any problems, then by all means go and have a look at the individual, or even run perhaps those two investigations in parallel. But if you're going to ignore, if you're going to actually, the problem with the law in England is it's actually much easier to go and investigate an individual for gross negligence manslaughter than it is to investigate a corporate organisation. Because I'm sure it won't surprise me to tell you that there hasn't been a single hospital in England that has been successfully convicted of corporate manslaughter. I don't happen to think that's a good idea. That is not a good spend of public money that we go around after hospitals and we try and convict them for corporate manslaughter. But it just illustrates the difficulty that we have in actually that if you are much more likely to be able to investigate and have a better chance of conviction of an individual than an organisation. That cannot be right. And what I'm pleased about is that Norman has done a review, and there has also been an independent review which has been led by Leslie Hamilton, and I'm from the Doctors Association, and we were invited to be part of that as well. And that is actually, the consistent things that have come out there is that you must look at the system, you must look at individuals, and you must look at them equally. Yeah. And you must also have consistency, and you must also look very carefully at the local investigation. I want to spend just 2 brief minutes on talking about local investigations, because in any of the areas that we work in healthcare, or business or anything, but particularly in healthcare, we all know about the serious untoward incidents report, and that when an untoward incident happens, there is always a local investigation. And what I found and we're not surprised actually, that is where it goes wrong. That's where the fingers start being pointed. That's where, if something's gone wrong, people start writing agendas. They're starting to write narratives that means that there's someone, the last man or woman standing, unfortunately usually a person of colour or ethnic minority or an outsider, that is actually the person in the room that is more likely to be blamed for that event. There's a picture of a helicopter that you can see on this slide. We should be applauding people for actually reporting mistakes, as long as they're not reckless, as long as they're not things that are sort of willful, because those people absolutely should be held accountable. The full force of the criminal law should come against any healthcare worker that has committed a wanton event against a patient. But if we're talking about honest errors, because I want to make a very clear distinction here, then we should be supporting and consoling and fixing the system that allowed that individual to actually commit that error, and applauding those individuals when they speak up. We should not be having the system that we have at the moment, where if you're actually from a black and ethnic minority background, you are more scared to talk about error in the workplace because you know that you are more likely to be blamed for it. That is completely wrong. And that's something that as a healthcare system we should be tackling today.
Jenny, let me...
So I know I've wandered off your point. I do not think actually the law should be changed, because I think in England, with the recent appeals, we can't argue for special laws for healthcare workers. I'm totally on the side of patients. I'm on the side of recognise that this is a common law. But we need to actually emulate Scotland in our culture that says, let's deal with them all in a balanced and equal fashion and make sure that patients are always at the top. I refer you to the slide at the right. There's one thing at the top there, and it talks about bereaved patients and their relatives and how we treat them. Because I've spoken a lot about staff, and I suspect I have a reputation. She's on the side of the doctors. I'm actually not. I'm on the side of the truth. And that's the only thing that drove me through the 3.5 years of the wilderness of David's appeal, was what is the truth here? And the truth is that actually if healthcare workers know that they're going to be treated in a safe way, whatever their colour in the background, patients will be made safer. The criminal law is far too blunt to go against healthcare workers committing honest errors. And that's where I'd like to finish.
Okay, excellent. Well. David, I wanted to ask you, we have many people in the audience today who are risk managers, incident investigators. They may well be some of the people who would have written the report that was shared with the prosecutors in your case. What is your message to people in the audience now? It's very clear everybody wants a system change, a cultural change. For those people who are doing the work on the ground tomorrow when they get back to their hospital, may be faced with a clinical mistake, what would you like to see them do? How should they approach such an incident?
They've got to be thorough, they've got to be impartial, and they've got to be open. I think the problem that I encountered in my case, which I touched upon briefly, but obviously didn't have time to really propound upon to any extent, was the fact that the root cause analysis, which was written at the end of my case, was written by one of the hospital's own staff, quality manager. It was a very good document, it was a very thorough document, but unfortunately that document wasn't produced during the entire investigation that I went into. And that looked into corporate provisions, whether there were sufficient nurses on the ground, whether they did the right things, whether there were other doctors involved.
And do you think if that had been produced, you wouldn't have been convicted?
Well, I don't know that, but I think the chances are that, as Jenny has quite rightly said, and as Norman said, we don't practice in isolation. Medicine is far too complex for people to simply do things and walk away. There are other people involved, there are systems involved, and I think the whole systemic issue needs to be put open, really, for scrutiny. Because during my trial, whenever one of my own defense said, well, what about the hospital? The judge would say to them, it's not the hospital that's on trial, it's David Selou. This, unfortunately, was the statement that was made right throughout. What about other doctors that were involved? What about nursing provisions? And I think this is where I also have a bit of a disappointment with the regulation about, because there were nursing issues that arose out of my case, which unfortunately still remain unresolved. A nurse, for example, gave that patient a very lethal, powerful anticoagulant. We've highlighted that case, and up to today, we don't even know the name of that nurse. It's not been identified. The regulators they're just not talking to one another. I mean, it's a bit like a crash on the M1, as I talked about. You get the electricians coming and then going away, and then the panel beaters coming a bit later, and I think it's very haphazard.
In her defence, actually, she gave the dose of a drug that was prescribed on a drug chart. She actually didn't commit any wrong there.
Let's not get too bogged down with that.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I just wanted to bring James in here
yeah.
because in what David just said is very similar to you as a patient experienced similar regulatory failings, didn't you, James? And we're talking here about cultural change.
Yeah.
And I know that something happened to you in 2016 that really made a difference for you and I think made a difference for the clinician as well. Just briefly, tell us about
as
that.
As quickly as I can then, you're absolutely right, Sean. So I was in a situation in 2016 where the Kirkup report had been published, but I still hadn't had a proper investigation into my son's death. And the Trust actually agreed to do and we've talked about local investigations, it's why I'm passionate about improving local investigations. And the Trust did this piece of work, and by that time, a particular midwife had been suspended by the Trust for 9 months, okay? And the Trust had a bit of a dilemma. Should we sack this midwife? And I had a conversation with the Chief Executive. Would I be prepared to meet her, okay? And this midwife, I didn't blame for Joshua's death, but I was absolutely of the view that she hadn't been open and honest about what happened. So I was really angry with this person. And we had this very carefully facilitated meeting. And the first thing I was able to say to her was, look, I don't blame you for my son's death. And I was about to go on and say, but I do blame you for being not open and honest about it. I didn't get the chance, Sean, because at that point, this midwife burst into tears. She was inconsolable, she was crying, and she said, James, but I blame myself, and I have done every single day since it happened. And at that point, I realised actually that she wasn't this uncaring, callous person. She was somebody who deeply cared about what happened. That for whatever reason, she wasn't able to be open and honest with me at the time. And I passionately believe, the culture of that unit of Furness General was, and today we've got this great Just and Learning Culture Charter from NHS resolution. If what's in here was embedded in that unit at the time, I think she could have had that conversation with me, and I think all that angst for me and her could have been avoided.
And so this is a leadership, isn't it, Norman? I mean, this is about, in that case, Jackie Daniels, the chief executive, took a real gamble to put the two people together, but it actually had a positive effect. And that was her leadership.
Absolutely, and I think that's absolutely key. And I think you can nip a lot of these things in the bud straight off by an honest, open conversation with the family, with the patient, with the family, etc., etc. And saying sorry goes a long way. I'm meaning it. I mean, not just, because you're supposed to say it, but actually meaning it. And I think I'm a great optimist, and I do believe that the system is changing. I work in St George, I'm a non-executive director there. I do perceive the way that we're handling now seriously, based on the cases that have gone before and the recommendations, that there is a sea change going on, that there is an acknowledgement that these things do not happen in isolation. But I do think it's absolutely crucial, because if we get it right, then only the truly exceptionally bad will get to the stage of prosecution. Yeah. And I think we're finding that actually in the data that's coming through. Yeah. A lot less are being done. And the police actually understand that, the CPS understand it, whereas they didn't understand it before. Yeah. So you're absolutely right, leadership is key, and I think we've got it in, it in place.
And Andrew, I just want to bring you in here, because I know that you are trying to help the system in some ways, and the NMC is actually rejecting some referrals from organisations, and you're effectively saying to them, actually, this needs a more systemic, this isn't about this nurse, and that's quite a change for the NMC, isn't it?
We've always tried to take context into account, but we're actually doing it in a much more consistent way now, and also thinking through some of the broader factors that we need to take into consideration in coming to that judgment. But you're absolutely right. It is also about us trying to help the system, and help the system to identify what is it that they need to do around what do we see are good local investigations? Because we do see some good local investigations.
Yeah.
We can feed that back, and we can also feed back what's maybe not quite so good and what's not helpful. What we can also feed back is where we are seeing those systemic issues, where there are other things that are being taken into account, need to be taken into account, and encouraging people to do that, because that's what leaders need to take on board. And the final thing I just want to say, it's not good enough for the Nursing and Midwifery Council to do it all by itself. We do have to work, and we are working with our other professional regulators, in particular the General Medical Council, to try and do things proactively.
Yeah.
And so colleagues in the audience may have been at the GMC session yesterday about tackling professional, unprofessional behaviours. We are working with them on that. Where all 9 professional regulators signed up to a statement 2 weeks ago on reflective practice and encouraging that. So I think there are things that we are doing now. There is clearly more that we can do. You have my commitment that we will.
Well, we are into our last second, so I just wondered if I could ask each of you or all of you to just tell the people in the room for tangibly what they can do to maybe move the NHS away from a blame culture. Anybody out there? Well, what would be your advice? I don't know who would wish. David, if you...
Well, I think the whole business about blame has got to go. We've got an adversarial system.
Yeah.
And I think in that system, it's very difficult to get people to really put up their hands. You know, when something goes wrong, say, look, I got it wrong. Instead of saying, well, let's look for somebody to blame for this. Because for as long as that culture exists, we're never going to be able to get the system right.
Jenny, in one sentence.
Yes, the Doctors Association is promoting a new campaign, Learn Not Blame. We know that, when I say no blame, I think it should be just culture. I think patients do need to know, and they only trust a system if they can see somebody as a system is accountable, changes will be made. I think if we just say, oh, let's not blame anybody, then I don't think that's it. We need to operate within a just culture. Staff are operating in a psychological safety environment, all the things that James and Andrew have actually have operated. Sign up to a Learn No Blame in your workplaces whenever you go back, whatever you're doing, treating your colleagues in a good spirit, working with them in a good way, and seeing that actually we're all part of this. It's not something that has to be driven from the top, although obviously it's very helpful when that happens, but all of us are actually part of how these things happen, and when things go wrong, how we behave, and the narratives that come out of that, and declaring our mistakes. I know it wasn't a sentence.
That was a paragraph.
Sorry.
So Norman, she's stolen your sentence now, so you literally only have a few words.
Oh, right. Well, I'll just say I think everybody in a leadership position should admit their mistakes, because that encourages junior people, trainees, to understand that even a consultant, head of department or whatever, chief nurse, can make a cock-up. And I think that would really help. one sentence.
Not quite.
Andrea, one thing that people should do when they get back to their organisation tomorrow?
Just think about the people, listen to them, act on what they tell you, and be kind.
Yeah.
And I think it's entirely right to end the Congress with a patient perspective. James, take us home.
So 2 thoughts, Sean. The first is we've talked about that local first investigation. And I think it's crazy that we live in a healthcare system still where we're asking people without training, without qualifications, to carry out local processes. So we need to professionalise and have standards for local processes. And the only other comment is I think we need to avoid the term accountability becoming kind of a bad word. It's crucial to adjust culture, but what we need to shift towards is collective accountability for building safer systems. And that's a challenge that we need to rise to.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think our panel deserve a round of applause for their excellent session.
Good.
Now, it falls to me to wish you a good journey home, and I just wanted to very quickly take 2 seconds of your time to tell you that I hope you've enjoyed the Congress. I've learned today that textbooks have been changed because of conversations that were had at the Patient Safety Congress last year, and actually international research has been commissioned because of conversations that were had at the Congress last year. So I do believe we're helping you to make a difference to patient safety. Very quickly, I'd just like to let Stephanie Muir know from Howell Dar University Health Board that you won our feedback competition, and £150 will be on its way to you, so congratulations. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't know about you, there's a lot to think about. I do believe that we are hearing signs of change. We are having conversations that are very different to the conversations we used to have 5 years ago. I've seen patients at this Congress talking to very senior clinicians. I've seen very senior clinicians talking to much junior clinicians, talking to me. There's conversations going on around this Congress, and hierarchies are being made a little bit more shallow, perhaps. But ladies and gentlemen, I've enjoyed being your host. Have a safe journey home, and I shall see you on the 13th and 14th of July next year. Thank you very much.